Thank you. Thank you for the generous support, for the generous introduction. And it's really great to see all of you here, especially at an extraordinarily busy time of the semester. So thank you very much. I want to start by acknowledging the collaborative nature of this initiative. My undergraduate RA, Grant Tabler, a third-year major in sociology and government, who coded over 1,000 reports to build the database for this. He started working back in May. In an early stage of this project, Cinta Taylor, another undergraduate major, also provided the labor for coding reports. We've also received analytical collaboration with William Greenland, the Director of Strategic Analysis in the A&S Dean's Office, and geospatial analytical support from the Scholars Lab, the geospatial scholarship office there. So thank you. Very much a group initiative. So estimates vary as to how many civilians have died in Syria since the start of the conflict in spring 2011, but it's somewhere in the range of 200,000 to 400,000 people. Murder, torture, and bombing, or direct violence against civilians, comprise, however, just one component in the repertoire of violence in this conflict. Significant, too, is the destruction of culturally and historically significant sites and objects, some of it collateral, and much of it deliberate. In Syria, between 2011 and 2016, some 1,200 culturally significant monuments were damaged or destroyed, and we know that in at least 300 of these cases, it was intentionally inflicted through looting and combat. And a small subset in both Syria and Iraq, small but significant, is what we're coding deliberate and performative cultural destruction, an example of which is on the screen in front of you. The Temple of Bel, built sometime in the 1st century AD in Palmyra, stood until August 2015 when the Islamic State blew it up using barrel bombs. And in this photo montage from an official publication of the Islamic State called Dabiq magazine, you can see the different stages as Islamic State sympathizers prepare, move barrel bombs into position, and then film the explosions at a distance, leaving just a few fragments of this 2,000-year-old temple. So the toll has also included 4 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, dozens of mosques and shrines, as well as churches, synagogues, tombs, libraries, and museums. And I want to highlight 2 things right off the bat. The first is that the majority share of destroyed cultural sites were Muslim, Shia, and Sufi. So much of the attention in the Western media focused on classical, archaeological, museums, and sites like these, but really, more than 3/4 of the intentional cultural heritage destruction was aimed at sites in active practice for Muslim populations and communities. I want to highlight, too, that it has often been offered as an explanatory theory throughout this conflict that it is because of ISIS's strict adherence to Wahhabi Islam that they are compelled to destroy culturally significant sites and other objects that are classified as idols. And so idolatry has been offered as an explanatory mechanism for this practice in this conflict. But historically, iconoclasm in Islamic communities has taken on very different forms, and it can range from symbolic defacement to all-out dismantling. But there's nothing in teachings that requires this level of destruction. So I don't want us to take for granted material obliteration as somehow compelling this insurgent group. It is in fact something that merits systematic testing and explanation. And one of the things we don't know yet is the underlying pattern of violence connected with cultural violence, and especially the killing of civilians. So here's an overview of today's talk. First, I'm going to highlight some significant prior research from sociology and political theory, from political sociology, and then from conflict archaeology. Next, take you into the background for this specific case, the Syrian conflict. Then the third section of the talk will just bring you into our project, the questions we have decided to focus on, the data sources that we have compiled, and then some preliminary analysis. And I want to leave a lot of time at the end for questions and discussion with all of you. After sharing the preliminary analysis, you'll see that we're really looking for critical feedback on these hypotheses. I'm interested in your thoughts on which of these hypotheses we can break off usefully into discrete areas of research for further analysis. And then really, what are the spatial and temporal analytical methods that could bear fruit? So let's start by looking at prior work in sociology and in political theory. So some of the classic statements on cultural destruction focus on the concept of genocide. And in Raphael Lemkin's early writings on genocide after the Second World War, he coined the term vandalism to explain that the deliberate destruction of artworks and other culturally significant sites is a component of group-specific targeting for annihilation. Lemkin emphasized that cultural violence is genocide, that there's no need for a separate term like cultural genocide. That term has been used frequently throughout the Syrian conflict. That separation, Lemkin said, doesn't make any sense. Johan Galting more recently has asserted that cultural violence is a means to an end, that what cultural violence is actually doing is justifying or legitimizing direct violence, which he defined as murder, torture, rape, and other physical acts against human targets. And then Damien Short and Charles Tripp have both argued in different ways that the destruction of art needs to be considered a performance of power by state actors in specific moments of violent transition. For them, the key cases are, say, state-state transitions. The downfall of Saddam Hussein and the removal of his public statuary would be a key example for them. Of course, we know that this dynamic can also play out when insurgent groups are attempting to topple a state and then take aim at state-aligned symbolic sites and objects. Shifting gears then to political science, quite a bit of work on civilian violence emphasizes that civilian killing in civil wars is strategic. So Benjamin Valentino has urged that we think that civilians are not merely bystanders, that civilians play a central, if involuntary, role in the material, financial, and human requisites of war. And so, contrary to traditional governments, insurgents rely directly on the civilian population for supplies, intelligence, shelter, and recruits, especially when they are not receiving significant material resources from foreign sponsors. Of course, ISIS is a bit of an interesting case here. We know that foreign receipts were a significant source of income, but at very different times in the conflict. So they were also relying quite a bit on in-kind material support, coerced, forced, and sometimes voluntary from civilian populations. So it was very much their interest, especially with their rapid territorial expansion in 2015 and 2015, to have a very balanced relationship to the civilian population in new territories that they took over. Looking at the concept of extra-lethal violence has been productive for us in thinking about why a regime would undertake deliberate and performative cultural violence. So this concept, extra-lethal violence, comes from Lian Fuji, who passed away just a few months ago, sadly. But this is a powerful concept for helping to understand why a regime would employ practices such as lynching, mutilation, beheading and displaying corpses in ways that are resource intensive and that would actually seem to be counterproductive if the goal is to wipe out as many hostile subjects as possible. So for her, the argument is that extra-lethal violence is a form of asserting power against sub-state elite actors, and that has a kind of terrorizing effect on a local opposition. The emphasis here is on local. So for her, it's not really useful to look at a state level, but instead take it to the meso, the civic, or the city, the region, to understand how this might have a psychological effect on opponents. And then two other just like key findings that I want to highlight, that ethnic affiliation serves as a proxy for enemy status when group or party affiliation is unknown. And this could be significant for thinking about why certain sites and objects were targeted by ISIS. Perhaps cultural affiliation stands in too as a strategic proxy. And then I'm very interested in Azam and Hifler's work. They used a two-stage game theory simulation to argue that soldiers in civil war loot, pillage, and terrorize civilians for direct military interests. They test prior theories that soldiers engage in this behavior when their leadership is weak, or out of desperation, or boredom, amusement, or otherwise like opportunistic randomness. This, too, they say, is strategic behavior, and in conjunction, too, with the ISIS looting patterns, I think it's important that we think about this related work in looking for strategic motivation. I'm at the last slide in recounting some prior and recent work. I should say, if you have questions at any point, please raise your hands. Very much interested in a sort of back and forth style here. In my teaching reviews, students tell me that I should slow down on my slides. So I'll slow down my slides. So conflict archaeologists,
Question.
yeah, Tom.
You said, when you were on the previous slide, non-lethal violence, you mentioned beheading and
Extra lethal violence, right.
I was, it sounds lethal to me. I was a little confused by the term.
Extra lethal, so beyond necessary to kill someone.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so a specific example would be you can kill a person by shooting her in the back of the head, and you can also kill a person by lynching her, drawing and quartering the body, displaying the parts, right? And these kind of like grotesque. Yeah, I'll stop there, Tom. But you're right.
Okay.
It goes above and beyond the call of duty to eliminate an opponent. Right, and in a similar way, you can blow up a temple with an airstrike or shelling in a way that doesn't require the intensive resources of a film, a soundtrack, a staging, an audience. And ISIS was employing that kind of extra lethal violence to cultural sites and objects. That's the parallel I'm trying to make here. Thank you for that. Any other questions on that slide? Right. So conflict archaeology is this really interesting and recentish subfield of, we might say, the stones and bones crowd, field archaeologists, who are now working with spatial temporal methods through georeferencing data sets to understand macro-social duress and how it patterns onto the destruction of cultural sites. So in some key recent publications, it's been demonstrated that deliberate damage to cultural sites is correlated with weak states and low levels of local guardianship. And that might be super obvious, but it's an important finding with policy ramifications, because many of the critics of the current conflict have argued that state actors just need additional resources and weapons to put more people out at sites to protect them from looting and damage. It just is about how effective the central state is in all of its apparatus, whether a site is likely to survive a conflict. The second bullet point then here refers specifically to the Syrian conflict. And we know that cultural destruction was carried out by all fighting factions. This is not an ISIS problem alone, but was most intense in ISIS-occupied areas. And intensity here is measured in terms of degree of physical loss. So ISIS overall had a smaller N of damaged sites, attributed it to it, but that N contains almost total destruction. So when they do go after a site, they are going to make sure it's obliterated. Any questions about those findings? Okay. So there are some key limitations to the prior work. Firstly, the ideological or more theoretical explanations do not address potential relationships between cultural violence and civilian deaths. So Lemkin does us a great contribution by emphasizing the centrality in cultural destruction to the elimination of despised cultural groups. But he does not say anything about how that would play out in real time, how it's staged, or even why some groups do undertake concerted efforts at cultural violence and others don't. They will go for a different form of genocide that's much more centered on direct violence. Second, strategic explanations of civilian deaths have largely overlooked extra-lethal activity in the cultural sector. That again goes back to Tom's question and what I'm thinking about as a parallel. And then finally, we don't know whether cultural violence replaces, amplifies, or intensifies civilian casualties. So in early stage of this work, I wondered whether it would be possible to say, when an insurgent group is busy blowing up temples, it's good news for civilians because they're not busy going after civilians. They don't have time, they don't have the manpower, and or strategic priorities have shifted. That's an example of the kind of question that we're trying to examine. And we don't yet have work that sets us up to answer that question. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, what do you know about the Holocaust? Were Nazis also destroying synagogues? That's kind of one thing I can try to.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's a genocide. So, what was the attitude towards physical Jewish monuments?
Mm-hmm. So after passing race laws in Germany, and it was a similar process happening in fascist Italy, Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues were taken over by the Reich, supposedly to pay debts. Some synagogues ended up being destroyed. Many of them were repurposed, especially if they were in nicer locations. But so that happened in close proximity to anti-Semitic Aryan racial laws happening. So in Germany between about 37 and 38, in Italy a little later.
That's a case where those were useful buildings.
Yeah, but also
Right.
Kristallnacht. We just had another anniversary of Kristallnacht in 1938, I guess it was, and where they just had massive destruction, not just breaking the windows, but going much farther of any Jewish-owned business or institution or cultural building, etc.
Absolutely, thank you for that. And cemeteries and artworks and archives and libraries, it was ruthless, and it was really kind of throughout the so-called right territories claimed by the Nazis. Does that help? Sure does. Okay.
I mean, the previous studies addressed that. I guess in that case, hatred was so obvious. I guess one puzzle, in quotes, I know of is, again, why would, towards the end of the war, when the point is to survive or like to fight militarily, why was the Reich spending so many resources on the genocide towards the end? Initially, the cultural destruction is, I mean, we know why it happens, hatred and ideology. In this case, like, doesn't that go some way, a long way towards explaining the same thing? It's an ideology.
I think I'd need to know a little more myself about the end stages of conflict in the Nazi regime. The end stages of conflict here are sort of still happening. There's still insurgent fighting and still civilian deaths. So I don't have a firm theory yet or response to that. But it's very helpful in thinking about those parallels, and one thing that we've discussed a lot.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
one thing that I might note is going through the reports is that ISIS was engaged in repurposing a lot of these sites. They would go in and repurpose a Christian school or repurpose a Christian church into either a recruitment center, a training center, or even prisons in cases. So they were engaged in not just destroying these, but if they were in strategic locations, then taking them and turning them into something for the purpose of the Islamic State.
Yeah,
There's
and
a trade-off.
I'm
There's
sorry.
a fundamental trade-off there, actually, in how you treat these sites, right? And there's a big distinction between repurposing a site, right, which is sort of building a new religious institution or an administrative institution on one that had previously existed, and destroying the previously existing institution or site for all to see. That's a very different action with different consequences, right? The whole history of conquest in the New World is the first, right? Taking indigenous institutions, religious institutions, administrative institutions, and putting the new ones on top, and sending a signal about what that means as sort of a signal about who is in power. We're we're going to keep some of your institutions that are helpful for us, and we're going to get rid of others, completely annihilating religious or administrative institutions is something quite distinct. It seems to me interesting to think about from the vantage point of the conquerors why you're doing one versus the other.
Yeah, right.
I was just gonna add, in Peru, what they did is they would knock down like the upper part of these temples and all that, and keep these stone foundations, which were pretty much earthquake proof, and then build on top of them, but the parts they built on top were frequently demolished by earthquakes. Nevertheless, it was, again, to show that they were destroying the old and imposing the new. So, that would be another parallel case with what you're doing.
And I want to say, in response to this last set of comments, I do not think that ISIS is a special case in being, say, worse than previous instances of genocide at all. We haven't even talked about the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. The Cultural Revolution in China also showed a similar proclivity for, we could say, extra-lethal violence in very public and staged deliberate destructions of cultural resources. But what ISIS has left us is much more data than those earlier historical periods. It has been said that ISIS has been very zealous in their broadcasting of these events in a way that the Nazis were not. That is not true. Nazi official publications exulted in successful demolishments or destructions of enemy population property and cultural goods. But what we have here is a digital imprint and high-resolution satellite imagery that can also help to capture in finer grained detail time and space relationships in the kind of against the backcloth of the war overall. I feel it's necessary to say that because in focusing so much on ISIS, it's really easy to forget that they are in a way taking from a well-established playbook in genocidal conflict. The images on the screen show you the rapid territorial expansion of the Islamic State starting in March 2014 when they hold about a quarter of the landmass. By June 2015 and then on through March 2016, they have almost half of the landmass. Significant that the highest concentrations of population, urban density, is over here. These are many wide open spaces here, not to say insignificant, but in terms of civilian casualties, what's significant is when they are occupying these areas in Raqqa, Aleppo, and Homs. Right. So our case has, as Grant will tell you in just a couple of minutes, we have been studying all of the data, all of the reports possible from a group called the American Schools of Oriental Research, which started recording systematically in early 2014?
August 11th.
Okay, right on through today. This is just one screenshot that shows you that in Palmyra, Syria alone in the summer of 2015, half a dozen, more than that, monumental classical structures were deliberately destroyed by the regime, and often presented in interesting ways to audiences, plural. But this photo montage, which is taken from one of their publications, Dubique Volume 10, emphasizes this as a positive activity that the Islamic State is bringing to the local population. So up here it says, smashing the idols and statues of ancient nations and erasing their legacy of shirk or idolatry. So you can see that this man in the military fatigues is using a sledgehammer to destroy marble portrait statues from the Greco-Roman period. That's what's laying out here. Here we have on the upper right, collecting and safeguarding the zakah, the kind of like tributes or taxes paid by the people, paid by the Muslims in preparation for its distribution to those eligible, and then down here, giving zakah to those eligible to receive it. So I think this is very interesting that what they're doing is displaying the positive benefits of strict Sharia interpretation, that ridding the local town of the idolatrous objects is tantamount to to welfare support, and to safeguarding of the public coffers. I'm putting this in here to show, too, that ISIS's sophisticated broadcasting strategy was playing to multiple audiences. And so in addition to these images of fairly brute application of force, they were also executing people here at Palmyra, at a site not far from where the statue smashing happened. They were also emphasizing the positive benefits. So it's a complicated narrative. Maybe this brings us closer to the strategic import. There's almost certainly too much text to read in one go here, so let me tell you what's going on here. All of the coding that came to us from the more than 1,000 reports that we took from ASOR include military activity, explosives, and airstrikes, right down to site management, tourism, and visitor activity. So in every instance of a cultural site being destroyed, this group attributed a causal factor. And it's no surprise that the number one cause of damage at these cultural sites would be explosives and airstrikes. Collateral damage, these are powerful weapons. They are limited in their accuracy. So wherever you have airstrikes, you have a lot of things being damaged in an urban setting. So we have been trying to focus our research, I don't have a pointer, but military activity, intentional performative destruction. Can you see just above my finger there? I didn't bring my reading glasses or a pointer, so I'm slightly in the dark here. But we're interested in how it is in the first 6 months of 2015, this activity intensifies and then kind of drops and drops. So yes, it's a less significant category of activity than the artillery and the kind of state-sanctioned military strikes. But for insurgent groups, this turns out to constitute a symbolically powerful as well as a materially powerful form of violence.
But what about intentional destruction, the third from the top?
Yeah, so that would include military repurposing, clearing walls or clearing a cemetery to build a road, storing munitions and having an accidental explosion, or storing munitions and having a deliberate staging of it. And that does include the Syrian army, as well as allies, Russian military actors, and insurgent groups. So that for us has been a big project in trying to tease out these different actors and group affiliations. Okay, let's go to then our project, which has tried to focus on the civilian casualties in relationship to cultural violence. So our central puzzle, as I said, concerns episodes of deliberate and performative cultural destruction. And we ask two key questions. First, what are the underlying patterns of violence in these events? And second, if the key objective is to eliminate hostile combatants and unpersuadable civilians, why expend extra effort destroying cultural goods? So to get at these questions, we have been working with 4 data sources. The Violations Documentation Center in Syria, the ASOR Cultural Heritage Initiatives data, which Grant will explain in more detail, the Syrian Archive, which has been an aggregation effort of multiple data sources and sources of report, and then the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. I'm going to walk through each one and tell you why we've used it and what we've done with it. And first, Grant is going to explain the ASOR CHI data. I'd like him to do this because he's been working on this for 6 months, knows the reports inside and out, and this really was the major piece of work accomplished through the QC grant, was coding all of these reports. So would you like to come and explain what you did? Great.
So I began looking at these reports in May of this past year, and I've read through about each one of them, I think probably 3 times by now. And they've gone through multiple levels of coding. So as Professor Greenland mentioned, there's over 1,000 reports, and from that, our data set has 1,166 individual data points. And one thing to notice about this is there are limitations before we get into some of the coding. There are some limitations to the reports in that some reports can be as vague as unnamed mosque in certain region, and it happened in a time period of 2012 to now, we don't know when it happened, we don't know who did it, and we don't know the amount of damage. So all of these things we had to account for lots of variation in the reports. And also one thing to notice too is that geocoordinates do disappear after 2014. We suspect that they still have the geocoordinates in their database, but that they've been censored so far. So I'd kind of like to show you two samples of the reports and run through how I went about coding these. So all of the reports are this style. They all follow a very specific structure. From 2014 to 2016, they do weekly and bi-weekly reports, and in 2017, they switched to a monthly structure. And the way that they gather these reports is through eyewitness reporting. They have an app that people can use. They cooperate these with news reports and other scholars in the region, and then they also do use high-resolution satellite imagery. So, as I mentioned, the final data set has gone through quite a few rounds of coding, and the reports, as you can see, do begin with incident number. And so this incident number we've left in the database, but we've also created a new number to identify each individual case, and that's our QC number. Because as you can't see it in this specific in one of these specific ones, but sometimes incident numbers have multiple sites damaged within it. So it might be multiple mosques that are damaged within it during different periods of time. So we've split that up and analyzed each specific site that's been damaged individually. This also leads me to a discussion of dates. So as you can see here, date is unspecified. And then in the second one, date is February 12th, 2017 or earlier. So there is not, due to the nature of the conflict and the lack of accurate reporting and the lack of on-ground reporting, there is not always a specific date that something happens. As I previously mentioned, we might not know the date, or it could be a period of time from 2012 on, or it could be over a period of weeks. In order to account for that, we've taken the report date, and that's what we've coded as the date in there. And we have two other columns which account for time periods, so start date, end date, and then that's how we kind of standardize those. Then I'd like to talk about kind of how we coded the site type. So as we've kind of seen, there are lots of different, there's a vast amount of specificity in these reports. And these reports can go very specific to UNESCO World Heritage Site and the specific village, to a specific type of church, or it could just say unnamed mosque. So in order to account for that variation, we've created 9 different categories, and those categories are a civilian site, a cultural site, a funerary, general Christian site, general church, general mosque, general Muslim site, shrine, and tell. And I'd like to walk you through a few of those categories. As you may have noticed, there is general mosque and general Muslim site, as well as general church and general Christian site. So how do we account for the difference between the two of those? General Christian site and general Muslim site has some sort of religious affiliation. It might be a religious school, a madrasa, or it could be a religious building, but it does not have the specific designation of a church or a mosque. And the next specific type of definition that I like to go through is cultural site. It can be very difficult to code a cultural site because all religious sites are cultural sites, but not all cultural sites are religious sites. And so in order to do that, we went back and looked at this site date. This is very important here. For example, if it's a monastery, and the monastery could be in use, and in that case it would be a general Christian site, but if it's not in use and it's a tourist destination, then it would be categorized as a cultural site due to the historic and cultural significance of the site. And then a tell, we talked about tells, funeraries, and a civilian site would be, for example, a restaurant or a market that was destroyed. And then, as also previously noted, There's many different types of damage types, as you saw on the last slide, and it would be, I think, very hard to conduct statistical analysis with over 50 different damage code designations. And oftentimes when sites are destroyed, there's more than one damage that occurs. There could be an airstrike, artillery fire, and many different things. And in order to account for that, what we did is we created a general damage code categorical variable. And we have 9 different categories for those. And the most notable of those would be intentional destruction, looting, militarization of a cultural site, airstrike, and urban warfare. And in order to categorize those, what I went back and looked through is I went and looked through these 2 parts. So we looked through pattern and incident source and description. And in each report, it gives a very different amount of specificity. So it'll talk about this Russians dropped a bomb on this site, Syrian government dropped a barrel bomb on this site, or it could be the Islamic State destroyed a certain site. But oftentimes there's more than one thing that's happened to these sites. So we had to go back and look at what is the impetus of the destruction, or what is the most significant aspect of the destruction in order to code it into one category. So for example, if there was an airstrike and it resulted in conflict in the city, then it would be coded as an airstrike because that is the most significant form of damage in that. And the 2 that I'd like to talk about is intentional destruction versus militarization of a cultural site. And those can sometimes be conflated, but I think it's important to separate those 2 out, because intentional destruction has a specific purpose of destroying the cultural site for people to see, for publication to beak, to kind of teach the people or to show the people that they're something that the Islamic State is trying to demonstrate. Whereas militarization of a cultural site, as we've discussed, is repurposing and using it for their own benefit. Following the general damage code, we've also separated that into 2 different types. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just curious, when you compiled the final spreadsheet, was it all hand-coded? And if so, were there multiple coders, and what did you do if the coders disagreed?
So yeah, they were all hand-coded by me. So I was the only coder, and I went through it 3 times, and so they're fairly accurate.
I mean, I can maybe add to that a little bit. I mean, I think that there's, so when I've now taken the data set and started doing some analysis on it, this is, I think, inevitably going to be a somewhat iterative process of sort of looking at the definitions. I'm often looking at the categories, but then reading the detailed definitions, which are also in the file, and then going back to that and saying, maybe we can break this out a slightly different way. So it's, I think, definitely the data set as it is not really in the final stage.
I sort of lost, the connection between what you're coding here and then the figures that Fiona showed.
Sure.
So it seems like you have different codes than what's there, and you said you have 1,000 events, but on there it was like way lower. So I'm just not understanding what the difference was between the sort of bar plot and then what you're coding here. Between the same data?
Yeah, so it's the same data, but as you can see here, there is, this is just a few amount, but there's over 50 different damage designations. And in order to account for those, we made it into a categorical variable.
But what I'm not understanding is you said you had 1,000 at the end, but clearly the total number of events here has to be way, way over 1,000.
Oh, okay, so
I'm not understanding how they line up.
So a site might be damaged more than once. And so there's 1,000 different incident reports.
Okay, so these are not mutually exclusive events.
Correct.
Mhm.
It's over 1,000 reports. And this is event number. This is the number of events. I think what I mentioned was they had over 1,000 reports.
Oh, okay.
But a given report could have more than one
Got
event
it.
in it.
Yes. Any other questions? And the last thing that we did was we separated it into 2 other types of, we further separated the damage code variable into human intentional social destruction and destruction by military weapons. So as we've noted, there's a vast difference between a destruction of an airstrike versus the Islamic State enacting their law. So what happened in a couple cases is the Islamic State would punish members in their control whose beard wasn't long enough, who were caught smoking, who were caught drinking, and force them to destroy a certain number of graves or destroy a certain number of idols. And that we have those two variables as human social activity destruction and destruction by weapon type. And I think that brings me to the end of talking about the ASOR data.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, a single coder working fairly intensely for 6 months. So we went through these together several times. I want to say 2 more things about this source. So why are we spending so much time on ASOR? This is to date, the only comprehensive store of information about cultural damage, specifically in the Syrian conflict. There are other efforts that are in various stages of their life cycle, from nascent to quite advanced to dormant because their funding ran out. Several of those other efforts relied solely on remote sensing and satellite imagery. This was the only effort to use eyewitnesses in addition to automated social media aggregation as well as satellite images. So we think that these data are very good. There are also limitations, and I do want to underscore that the primary funding source being the Department of State has also made us realize that certain key informational factors were redacted at a certain point in the war. I have theories about why and what was taken out, but it did mean that there are some blank spots in the information. And as Grant says, we've got georeferenced locations, georeferenced information from 2014, the early stages, and then that stuff disappears after 2015. So this is where the Scholars Lab has been helpful in teaching us how to generate our own georeferenced points. That's pretty laborious. Let me discuss then these other 3 data sets. And for the conflict specialists in the room, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on these data sources and how we can make the best use of them. So the Violations Documentation Center in Syria has been a key resource for us in lining up instances or events involving civilian deaths with the deliberate cultural destruction stuff. So what the VDC data looked like, use a screenshot, is this. So we've got column A is the names and the status. They can be, is a dummy variable, civilian or non-civilian. The gender and age, and then province, birthplace, death date, death cause, and actor. It's been really helpful for us to see the specificity of information here, going down to the state or non-state actor to whom the killing is attributed, the death cause, and then the dates. And that's, again, we think important in doing a fine-grained analysis and space-time event clustering.
Fiona, can I ask you about sort of the genesis of this data? So who's responsible for collecting that and assigning culpability?
Yeah. So trained human rights experts, civilian volunteers, also political activists and intellectuals. So there is some controversy around their civilian count. Their casualty count is much lower than other estimates. They're around 200,000, where other observation groups assert it's closer to 400 or higher. And it's also because they insist on thorough documentation for each casualty count. So the numbers are undoubtedly they are undercounting. But yes, so the information is gathered and documented by these data collectors, a group of human rights and field activists, and then reporters assigned by the center in different regions. Does that help?
Sure. I just think sort of culpability is tricky. You discover dead body.
Yeah, they're trying to file reports immediately after and talk to multiple eyewitnesses on the scene. ASOR have used a similar method in attributing responsibility for the action.
But I think, I mean, there's another sort of thing that we see start to come out in the data, which is that all of these different sources probably have their own sources of sort of self-imposed bias
Yeah.
of over or under-reporting certain actors and that kind of thing. And you can see that when you start to look at some of the sort of charts, you can see where one trend doesn't follow another.
Right. So they don't report on violations in government-held territories or among pro-government groups. And then the VDC observation method, as I said, could be undercounting casualties. So this way we have not relied only on the VDC data. So the Syrian archive, which I mentioned earlier, serves as an aggregator of local reporting from Syria, as well as several crowdsourced repositories. And we used this to corroborate figures derived from both VDC and ASOR. In other words, we wanted to check here to see that the other claimed violent events were also showing up here. So if it was a match, ASOR, VDC, and the Syrian archive, then we could be sure that the event happened and the scale and place that was claimed. So here's an example of a specific event that we were able to corroborate, and that was significant because there was a very high civilian casualty aligned with the deliberate and performative destruction. So as this is an aggregation effort, it's worth, as I said, noting that there have been several other aggregation efforts. So we're not sure that we can rely on this for the long term, for the life of the project going forward, but the Uppsala conflict data base has been very helpful this way. I know the conflict specialists in the room have worked with Uppsala. What we don't know is why the most recent downloadable versions of the full database don't appear to include Syria events. Okay, so that's the one thing that we're still waiting for. Let me just change gears then and get you to the hypotheses and the initial analysis. So we're right now, on the basis of prior work done, the data collecting, and the observations of the case, working along lines of a range of spatial and temporal hypotheses. I have already put these on the handout, so I think in the interest of time, I won't sort of explain all of them. But some of these, obvious but worth testing. Cultural sites that are proximate to urban areas are more likely to be damaged than those that are non-urban. Higher rates of cultural destruction will be co-located with airstrikes and shelling rather than street combat. That, of course, is speaking to the destructive nature of the weaponry involved. We hypothesize that the number of damaged cultural sites will increase near areas experiencing high rates of civilian casualties. And then the final two spatial hypotheses, that conflict zones involving state actors will feature higher rates of cultural destruction than zones of non-state actors for reasons, again, of access to weaponry. There could be strategic factors as well. And state actor presence is predictive of higher rates of both civilian casualties and cultural destruction. Take you to the second page now. The first two being more temporal, and then the final hypothesis 6 being temporal and spatial in nature. The incidence of collateral cultural destruction will peak with incidents of civilian casualties. However, the incidence of deliberate cultural destruction will peak inversely with the incidence of civilian casualties. And finally, we're hypothesizing that deliberate cultural destruction events will be clustered in time and space.
Just ask a quick question.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of, or do you have any way of getting at how many sort of cultural sites are at risk of being destroyed? Because those are going to be unevenly distributed across space.
Well, so the universe of cultural sites, archaeological museums, is 17,000 in Syria.
And you know where they are?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Is that good?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, very good.
I personally know where they are. Yes, that there's been intensive effort to locate all of them using Landsat 7 imagery, declassified corona imagery, and digital globe. So 17,000 is the kind of like agreed upon number now by conflict criminologists.
So not all these are equal, right? Some are kind of reasonable checks on correlations in the data. Would you say 5 is the key mechanism we are after?
Yeah. Yeah, for me it is, and probably the trickiest to isolate. Yeah.
Will others serve as control? I guess we'll get to that.
Yeah. All right. I need to drink, so I'm either going to go to the sink myself or ask for a Coke. So I'll just put that on the screen for a minute. Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. So 2 colored lines here. Blue referring to people, civilian and non-civilian, and orange referring to cultural damage. So this is our first cut at seeing how these kinds of events line up from late December 2014 through April 2018. Probably no surprise that when people are dying in airstrikes, buildings and sites are also being destroyed in airstrikes. We see here that, and that's just the Aleppo data, the Syrian Army Republican group. Across all governorates in Syria, again attributed to the Syrian army, shelling also kind of lines up with simultaneous civilian deaths and cultural damage. So for us, this is important. So it illustrates that at a high level, fatalities and collateral cultural damage are correlated when restricted in these multiple dimensions of place, time, actor, and method. So that's some descriptive or observational data. And then we tried to do some preliminary analysis. So that's what's going on in this slide. Do you want the previous?
Yeah, I know.
Oh, yeah.
You want to talk about this?
Yeah. Well, no, I guess I was trying to think about, I mean, you're showing only the relationship between civilian deaths and a particular. I'm going back to the slide that I think there are lots of questions.
The actor?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Or kind of why, like this is to me like not surprising, right? If you're shelling people, you're shelling. But that's very different from kind of the intentional damage, which I think is much more interesting. I would argue, right? You're right, but this is almost like.
So right. This is what you would expect to see. So the purpose of doing this up front was basically to say, Grant's done all this coding, you've got this VDC database, no one really knows if these people are reporting stuff accurately or not. But there's 2 separate sources, so if you line them up, they should be, if they're not biased, they should be the same. And in fact, what I haven't shown on here, but what I do have other charts that show, is that this is the Syrian government category, and these trends track very closely. If you look at the US coalition chart, it starts off tracking, and then the US cultural damage goes way down, but the casualties stay up. And so that suggests that the ASOR data is suppressing incidents of US-caused cultural damage, but that the VDC is continuing to track civilian casualties. So we wanted to sort of do this up front to sort of say, here's where there might be bias in these 2 data sets and sort of validate some of this stuff. And so the next chart, and I'll say, like, please ignore the sort of the regression stuff that I put in here because I did it yesterday evening, and it was a linear regression in Excel, and it was not well done. And I was actually looking at it again with some other methods this morning, and the results are the same, but you should just ignore the actual sort of regression notes in the next slide.
Yeah, and there's another point a few frames from now about how the data dry up in terms of attributed to the or cultural damage being attributed to the United States. It dries up in the ASOR reports, but we have it from a different data source. We know it's still going on. It's just the attribution to the group shifts. Josipa, does that clear up your question about this, or answer it for now?
Okay. For starters, yes.
Okay, great.
Replication until I see the rest.
So one thing that I was trying to do with the analysis, and one thing that I really have sort of questions for the group because it's totally beyond my realm of expertise, but I think the people who work with sort of conflict data may know how to do this, is actually if you jump back a slide again. So that blue line, so one of the things that you see, so I was sort of I picked I think a 90-day period here for grouping. So these are sort of 90-day buckets of incidents in both cases. But then for the blue line, I also smoothed it. I took a sort of a 3-period rolling average. Because otherwise what happens when you then try to sort of correlate them is that possibly due to sort of reporting time shifts or boundary effects, you're going to peak right next to each other in different sets. And if you just sort of feed that into regression, it doesn't see any relationship. If you look at it visually, you can sort of see, oh yeah, it's just that it was off by a couple of days. So I've sort of done some sort of data kind of, I'll call it fudging, to make a trend out of sort of lumpy data. But I would be really interested to know what is deemed to be the sort of the right approach to that kind of projection.
Quarterly sounds reasonable. Quarterly aggregation, just 3 months, not moving averages. Because we still want to see the raw data. I understand that they may be late reporting, but if you aggregate within 3 months, that's when
So part of the issue is that, as Grant mentioned before, for the cultural data, you'll get these dates where people say, we think, we noticed it at this date, but it might have happened in the previous 3 months. And so the cultural data especially is sort of sufficiently granular that if you get 5 incidents like that and they cross from one quarter into another, you're going to get this big sort of swing, right? And you'll see all of the sort of civilian casualties in one quarter and then all of the cultural damage in the next. So I was just trying to think of ways that I could sort of, avoid that type of, and again, it doesn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't make a huge difference. Most of these things do line up, but you do get these odd kind of boundary effects, I think due to some of that.
It will matter for the performative, deliberate cultural events. There are fewer of them, and then we're really trying to look at a hyper-local setting for those. So I think that the 3-month period would be a helpful cut at it.
It could happen the other way. I mean, we don't, sometimes we were looking, sometimes in the data, you can see that on the same day, it shows up on the same day in both sets. Sometimes, you'll see it's on the one day here, and then it's 5 days later in the other one. And so that's probably just a reporting thing. But so again, just trying to sort of, and maybe we don't need to correct. I'm just sort of open to hearing what people have done with that in the past.
Well, let's go to the next.
So in any case, in various, so again, ignore this particular kind of regression output, but in various sort of trial models that I've run, again, what you would expect based on those 2 previous charts, it's very highly correlated between deaths caused by airstrikes, for example, and civilian and cultural damage caused by airstrikes. With the caveat that I think that when we get increasingly sort of sophisticated with the modeling, we probably will see these biases come out of the sort of the US and US coalition cultural damage goes down once they stop reporting that sort of thing.
Do you know a sense whether they are no later than 3 months, say? It could be any, if it is not specified, it is probably no later than, not before 3 months ago. Do you have some
I think back to the question of recoding, I think that what we probably need to do at some point is take the existing coding data set, derive the categorical variables that we want from that, and then go back into, do a random sample, or maybe pick some of the ones where the data is specified as being vague, and have multiple people look at it and say, we think we can. So I think right now it's a bit too preliminary to even make a sort of blanket statement.
But we could combine it with satellite information. So Digital Globe has a tighter window on recording these sites, and that has been very helpful for for attributing causality to a particular group. In some cases, ISIS denied destroying a structure, but they were the only insurgency in town in that region in the kind of like 6-week window that Digital Globe captured. So it can be helpful, I think, to combine with the remote sensing and satellite imagery.
Actually have a response. It's just sort of dawned on me that this would work, because I work with sort of space-time data, and I've had the issues where the location is not clear, and so what I've done is just draw the location at random and generate multiple data sets this way and then average over them. And so you could do the same thing for places where the time window is unknown, but you have a window, just select the time at random, construct multiple data sets this way, and then average over, and this will then accommodate the uncertainty. And when you average it, then the between data set variation will include the uncertainty on the exact time. And that'd be a really straightforward way of doing it without having to correct all of it.
Right, so I think that's exactly where there are these there could be effectively that's another sort of smoothing technique in a way, right, for some of these things. So that's exactly the kind of thing that...
Yeah, the smoothing is also like, if you look at like criminology, right, it's really normal to take 3-year rolling out. So it feels like fudging is actually pretty standard for a lot of things. So I'm not distressed in any way by what you're describing.
So deaths here are measures of civilian deaths.
No, here I put in... I don't think the trend would be that different, but this was total deaths. Because again, this was just to establish that if we're reporting deaths from airstrikes, then we would expect to see cultural damage at the same time.
But you have both types of deaths, right?
We do.
You have civilian deaths and then total conflict deaths. So perhaps the more, the more interesting predictor, the more interesting relationship to look at is percentage of total deaths that are civilian, the relationship between that and monument destruction, right? It isn't surprising that total deaths would be strongly correlated with monument destruction, or destruction of any type, since destruction is leading to death. But I think what would be a sort of more subtle finding is that the percentage of death, which is sort of standard battlefield deaths, versus the percentage that are civilian deaths, are strongly correlated with the destruction of these monuments. So I'd like to see that particular period.
Definitely.
Do you think that would help us to understand strategic motive?
It would, because right now, I mean, you could argue that the findings are basically mechanical, right? That when you drop a lot of bombs, you create a lot of destruction. You're gonna get rid of these monuments, and you're gonna kill a lot of people. But that's not the story that's interesting to you. The story that's interesting to you is that there is some strategic logic which leads you to victimize non-combatants, to focus on victimizing non-combatants, that also leads you to engage in this strategic desecration. That, a first step towards evaluating that theory would be to look at these focused forms of death, civilian death as a percentage of total death.
And if we can go to the next slide, because again, so this is all about sort of establishing a sort of baseline and whether we can rely on the data. And then this is starting to look at, so now the orange line is only the intentional cultural destruction, and then that's against the, I think now in this case it is the civilian deaths, but again that's the death measure. So there are no sort of conclusions here yet, but the question is, like in Homs at the top, for example, we see the sort of destruction of Palmyra in the middle there. Is there some sort of spatial temporal relationship between those events and deaths?
I wanted to point out here, you'll notice that this line just stays at 0, drops to 0 after fall 2015. That's Aleppo. But this is a problem with the data, the ASOR data. So we know that cultural site damage continues in Aleppo through 2015 and 2016. The formal peace treaty is signed in December 16, so that explains why violence just drops after that. Violence in the city of Aleppo is characterized after this point by terrorist attacks, lone wolf, but not organized violence. But what happens in the ASOR data is that they stop coding things as intentional destruction. So this is where we're going to have to use other sources, think satellite imagery, and probably non-US data sources that have been studying these patterns of conflict to try to understand actor attribution. It's just another kind of thorny problem.
Yeah, so the ASOR reports only, from what I see, from what I saw, only took things in English, French, and German. So there wasn't any Arabic reporting in the data set. So that is a problem.
That's a significant issue. Yeah.
Was there any disaggregation of civilian casualties by adults versus children, male versus female, anything like that?
Yes.
To see how
The VDC data do specify adult, child, male, female, and then combatant, non-combatant.
Are you going to show this as support for H5? Is that what you're saying you see?
Oh, support for H5, you said?
I'm seeing support for H5 in this chart. Is that what you want us to see?
I mean, again, I'd say this is sort of too preliminary for that, but this is the type of sort of type of data that we would be looking at to go up after that.
Right. I mean, yeah, Tom, ideally, right, like if we just like chopped it off here, we would say we peak inversely, and then we all go home.
Yeah,
but
they don't kill as many people, and they start killing a lot of people, and they stop destroying stuff.
Yeah.
Then you can sort of squint at the top one and see the same thing there, because there's that big dip in the middle.
I think suggestive of the need for further analysis on that question, but that it might be heading in that direction. Liz.
I guess I'm curious as to why you phrase your hypothesis in terms of peaking. Is there something particularly interesting about the maximum
Oh, I see.
number, or you just hypothesize that they would vary inversely?
I really just mean the line is going up and to the right. I didn't mean that after that things end. Although there is some speculation that ISIS have been most intense in their deliberate destructive acts when they're desperate, they're running out of resources, and they're about to lose territory. That is not a consistent pattern, but it has happened in enough places, enough sort of like insurgent strongholds to suggest maybe. And there's also historical precedent for that in other insurgencies and other civil wars. Palmyra seems to be a special case. They came in and immediately dismantled things, but the civilian brutalities happened months later in earnest.
I guess
Sorry, go ahead.
The point I want to make is that, I mean, I could see arguments for asking both questions, but the nature of you could use a different type of analysis depending on what you're asking.
I see.
If you're just looking for whether the two vary inversely, that would be, an approach in a different way than if you're actually looking to find the peak. Is it opposite to the peak of the other hypothesis?
Yeah, that's a helpful clarification. Yeah, thank you.
I mean,
Yeah, and I think we talked a little bit before that, which is that the question is how do you handle all these zeros, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, so
Like, is it a true zero?
Yeah, well, and then regression, I mean, even when you look at a regression chart, right, like, you see that you violate pretty much every possible assumption of regression, which is that the regression is not the right way to do this, right?
Right.
And so trying to just rethink, which kind of goes back to this question, like, if you're gonna ask it differently, you would go after a different method, and even, it's not clear that a linear model is appropriate even apart from, even if the question is about just overall relationship, right, something like.
Mm-hmm. There are a couple hands up over here. David.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the discussion you just had with Liz, because like you can imagine that to go back to our original discussion an hour ago, like one reason you might destroy something that seems contrary or at least like distracting from your strategic goal is that like you're about to be kicked out and you know it, and you want to leave some kind of a mark, and that made me looking at that, and then your slide way back, but you don't have to go back to about showing the map of varying regions of control, suggests that I would be interested at least in seeing what happens in regions that are either like at the margins of control, where one group gets there and then
the edges.
is about to be kicked out, or a region that goes back and forth, right? Whether destruction is sort of higher there. And that's sort of like captured in some of the hypotheses that you had up there, but you didn't articulate it until like just now.
Yeah.
So I would be curious to hear more about that.
well, I think that's a sort of special case of the sixth hypothesis, which is to try and do some sort of clustering analysis of when the different things again sort of hit peaks in a sense.
Exactly.
And to see whether then, if you can sort of find like a hotspot of cultural violence, does that predict a hotspot of civilian violence, or are they, or just is one type of violence more clustered than another by some sort of metric, right?
Right.
Something's more spread out than others.
Right. I guess it's not. It's plausible. It's not like necessary, I suppose, that like that violence, that the areas of the highest violence would be the areas of like the most contested control and something. Like it could be, but it doesn't have to be.
There's,
You know, competent, like high frequency or like by date competent casualties, like ISIS as a major defeat.
Yeah.
Because what you said is
Yeah.
very interesting. I mean, maybe they say, well, we lost some morale, let's go blow up some temples to build team morale again. I mean, it's kind of sounds like what you said is anecdotally people say that after a major defeat they perform. You can test this.
Oh, do I contest it?
You can test that.
Uh-huh.
Data.
Yeah.
So kind of like
think-
a lead-lag relationship, maybe like destruction, cultural destruction in time t follows combatant loss in time t-1.
Yeah.
if the T's are, I don't know, month or week.
Yes,
or,
yes, and so the Fabiani publication I referred to uses vector autoregression to study kind of that lag, and so she's able to say what the temporal relationship is in insurgency conflict in Egypt and archaeological looting. I really want to test that too here. So that is really what I'm trying to do. So the Uppsala data are great for the event level, and then the VDC take us to the combatant status and a more fine-grained location and time. Adam, was your hand up? No.
I've got questions, but we'll keep moving.
Okay. Yes.
I'm just curious, are there any data as to who caused more, not just civilian casualties, but casualties that involve women and children? Would it have been ISIS, or would it have been the big airstrikes? And there's something behind that. Have you gotten any data on that to see which one is essentially slaughtering more indiscriminately?
The Syrian army has killed more people than anybody else.
Yeah, but
followed closely by Russian airstrikes.
Yeah.
And then allied or coalition airstrikes.
Okay, so what you're saying then that all of those are above and ahead of ISIS in terms of casualties?
Yes. Civilian casualties.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But the question then becomes, are there specific times within ISIS's ups and downs where they might more intensively kill civilians? This notion of, when things are going badly for them and they're about to pull out, might you be able to plot those two kinds of lines and see which way they're heading? That is temple, is like monument destruction going up in those desperate days, and is the proportion of civilian casualties that are women and children also going up in those desperate days, to see if perhaps there are sort of time-linked types of casualty and types of destruction. That might be something interesting to examine for ISIS versus just the mass bombing campaign.
No, that's right. That's important. And then, a final thought on that, Ray, is we're not interested really in seeing who killed the most civilians, right? But in the strategic logic of cultural destruction and its relationship to other forms of violence, notably civilian deaths. So so it's important to underscore that although the highest numbers are attributed to these state actors, that might not be significant for the kind of strategic testing that we want to do. I think we're at time. I'm really grateful for your comments and questions. My email's on the handout. Please be in touch if you have other questions or comments or suggestions. And thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you.
Yeah.